Good evening, beautiful people. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I hope you're having a fantastic day and week. Welcome to our live weekly YouTube readings of the final report of the California Reparations Task Force right here on the CJEC YouTube channel. This is the only live reading of the California Reparations Task Force final report on YouTube. The final report of the first in the nation California Reparations Task Force is one of, if not the most important government reports about the Black American community since the 1960s. Equally important, it's also the foundation for current and future reparations legislation in California. The report is nearly 1,100 pages long, and we're bringing you every page of it, chapter by chapter, every week on Thursdays at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, so that you are properly educated in your advocacy for reparations in California. Today's reading of the final report is presented to you as a community service with support from the Reparation Organizing and Mobilizing Team at the Coalition for a Just and Equitable California, CJEC. CJEC is California's leading grassroots organization born for reparations and reparative justice for Black American freemen living in California. For more info on CJEC and our work that helped to enact the law that created the California Reparations Task Force, California's laws requiring state agencies to collect data on descendants of U.S. slavery, the Act to End Current Slavery in California state prisons, and California Freemen Affairs Bill, and much, much more, please visit www.cjec-official.org. Before we go any further, I need you to do 3 things. Please like this video, hit the bell for reminders, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. After we're done reading tonight, I need you to do 3 more things. Get connected. Follow CJEC on all our social media platforms, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and X, formerly known as Twitter, at CJEC Official. Get informed. Visit www.cjec-official.org and sign up for the current and accurate California reparation news and info on our Get Involved page. Get involved. Support our work by volunteering and or donating. To donate, just click the Donate tab on the home page of our website. And special thanks to our amazing fiscal sponsor, the California Black Women's Health Project. By way of introduction, my name is Darlene Crumedy. I live in Fairfield, California. I'm originally from Los Angeles, but was raised in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I'm a volunteer reparations advocate with CJEC's Reparations Organizing and Mobilizing Team. This evening, we will be reading Chapter 16 of the final report of the California Reparations Task Force. The name of the report is A Recommendation for a California Apology. You can follow along with the reading by downloading tonight's chapter or the full final report yourself by going to our website at www.cjec-official.org/reports. Okay, we're about ready to start our reading, but before we do, I have some special thanks and announcements to make. First, as always, I'd like to thank our good friends at ET Media Group for their live readings of the first California Reparations Report. You can watch these readings of the first report on their YouTube channel at ETN Media Group or by visiting our website at www.cjec-official.org/videos. Second, for those of you who don't know, historic reparations legislation in California is here, and more is coming. SB 490 is California's first lineage-based reparations-related legislation to establish the California American Freemen Affairs Agency. The bill was introduced by State Senator Stephen Bradford and will move forward in 2024. To read the bill, please visit www.cjec-official.org/advocacy. Third, as mentioned, more historic reparation bills are coming. Over the next several months, more reparation bills will be written. During the 2024 legislative session, we'll see those bills introduced and start moving towards passage by majorities of both the California State Assembly and Senate. To pass reparations bills in 2024, we need 41 Assembly members and 21 senators to say yes. When those bills are passed, we need our governor to sign the bills. And to make reparations a reality in California, the math is 41 plus 21 plus 1. That's 41 Assembly members, 21 senators, and 1 governor. 41 plus 21 plus 1 equals reparations in California. This chapter is dedicated to my mother, Marita Levon Atkins, and sponsored by her children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and her great-great-grandchildren. The family names are as follows: Shepard Butler, Richardson, Crumedy, Rice, and Curtis. Lastly, but not least, special thanks to CJ's reparations organizing and mobilizing team, specifically our volunteer final report readers. And without further ado, Chapter 16 of the California Reparations Task Force final report. Chapter 16, Recommendation for a California Apology. Introduction. Reparative apologies situate the harms of the past in society's present injustices, pay tribute to victims, and encourage communal reflection to ensure the historical wrongs are never forgotten and never repeated. The international framework for reparation reflects this understanding, as set forth in the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 60/147, which delineates the basic principles and guidelines on the right to a remedy and reparation for victims of gross violations of international human rights law and serious violations of international humanitarian law. Quote, hereafter, UN principles on reparations, end quote. The UN principles on reparations include the principle of satisfaction. Satisfaction for victims will differ with the atrocity. It can include a public apology that constitutes an acknowledgement of the facts and acceptance of responsibility, judicial and administrative sanctions against persons liable for the violations, and commemorations and tributes to the victims, among others. Apologies alone are inadequate to provide justice to victims or redress wrongs, but when combined with the material forms of reparations, apologies provide an opportunity for communal reckoning with the past and repair for moral, physical, and dignitary harms. An effective apology should both acknowledge and express regret for what was done to victims and their relatives and take responsibility for the culpability of the apologizing party. Subtle differences in phrasing can denote unequivocal acceptance of responsibility for providing redress to victims and for making the changes necessary to guarantee non-repetition. An apology should also be accompanied by a request for forgiveness. As an example, when tribal leaders of Ghana performed a traditional ceremony of atonement for their role in the slave trade, they asked first for forgiveness for the horrors of slavery and their complicity in them. A universal satisfactory apology does not exist because each victim group has unique needs. However, in 2012, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights determined that the following elements form a good apology. 1, it must be made publicly. 2, it must be made at the place where the events occurred. 3, it must acknowledge responsibility for the violations that have been committed. 4, it must be made in the presence and with the participation of a considerable number of survivors and the next of kin. 5, it must involve the highest state authority and senior state officials. And 6, it must be broadcast and disseminated fully throughout the state. California has issued apologies in the compensation programs enacted for the human rights abuses in its eugenic sterilization program, violence and destruction of tribal communities, and incarceration of Japanese Americans. In 2003, the legislature, Governor Gray Davis, and Attorney General Bill Lockyer all issued formal apologies for their 1909 to 1979 eugenic sterilization program that forcibly sterilized patients in state hospitals and homes without true consent. Governor Davis' apology came quickly after he was informed of the sterilizations, but the apology was issued through a press release and did not call for deeper examination of the program. Reaction to the apology was mixed, with some expressing that it had come prematurely without adequate examination of the history and without sufficient effort to identify the individuals who would have been the recipients of an apology. Later, in 2021, the legislation passed Assembly Bill number 137, quote, 2021 to 2022, regular session, end quote, apologizing for sterilization at state prisons and creating the California Forced or Involuntary Sterilization Compensation Program, ordering the creation of memorial plaques in consultation with stakeholders, and allocating $4.5 million for financial compensation to those sterilized by the state. In June 2019, Governor Gavin Newsom signed Executive Order N-15-19, issuing an apology on behalf of the state of California to California Native Americans for the many instances of violence, exploitation, dispossession, and the attempted destruction of tribal communities inflicted upon California Native Americans throughout the state's history. Executive Order N-15-19 established a Truth and Healing Council to bear witness to, record, examine existing documentation of, and receive California Native American narratives regarding the historical relationship between the state of California and California Native Americans in order to clarify the historical record of this relationship in the spirit of truth and healing. This apology was not accompanied by compensation or remuneration of any other form of reparation intended to redress the violence, exploitation, dispossession, and the attempted destruction of tribal communities. But the council established by Executive Order N-15-19 may recommend further measures of reparation and restoration. Most recently, in February 2020, the Assembly adopted a resolution that apologized to all Americans of Japanese ancestors for the state's past action in support of unjust exclusion, removal, and incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II, and for its failure to support and defend the civil rights and civil liberties of Japanese Americans during this period. Similar to the apology to Native Americans June 2019, this apology was not accompanied by any form of monetary compensation nor any other affirmative act. The task force recommends the legislation to build upon the structure of previous state apologies and conform to the international standards for the principle of satisfaction. The legislation must apologize on behalf of the state of California for the perpetration of gross human rights violations and genocide of Africans Americans who were enslaved and their descendants through public apology, request for forgiveness, ensure of state perpetrators, and tributes to victims. But the task force does not recommend the legislation issue an apology without taking other required steps recommended by the task force to conform to the international standards for satisfaction. Such an apology would be hollow and ineffective. In issuing its apology, the legislation must formally apologize on its own behalf and on the behalf of the state of California for all the harms delineated in this report and for the atrocities committed by California state actors who promoted, facilitated, enforced, and permitted the institution of chattel slavery and its legacy of ongoing badges and incidents of slavery that formed the systemic structures of discrimination. California, its executive, judicial, and legislative branches denied African Americans their fundamental liberties and denied their humanity throughout the state's history, from before the Civil War to the present. By participating in these horrors, California further perpetrated the harms African Americans face, imbuing racial prejudice and throughout society through segregation, public and private discrimination, and unequal dispersal of state and federal funding. The apology must also include a censure of gravest barbarities carried out on behalf of the state by its representatives, officers, governing bodies, and the people. A non-exhaustive list includes an avid white supremacist, the first elected California governor, Peter Hardin Burnett, quote, 1849 to 1851, end quote, encouraged laws to exclude African Americans from the state. When the laws failed to pass, Burnett scorned the legislature in an 1851 speech that claimed any free persons of color, Californians would become so poor and disgruntled with unequal civil rights that they would start a race war against the whites. Later, as Justice of California Supreme Court, Burnett enforced the 1852 California Fugitive Slave Law and ordered the return of fugitive slave Archie Lee to his enslaver. John LeConte, a physicist and Confederate from South Carolina, was the first acting president of the University of California, quote, 1869 to 70, end quote. Although California entered the Union in 1850, outlawing slavery, the California Supreme Court stated that the anti-slavery law in California Constitution was only a declaration of a principle. In a unanimous decision authored by Chief Justice U.C. Murray and joined by Justice Alexander Anderson, quote, who also wrote a concurrence, end quote, and Justice Solomon Hatfield. The California Constitution said the state would not tolerate enslavement, but California had not enacted any laws to enforce this provision and emancipate slaves. The California Supreme Court also enforced the federal fugitive slave law until the official end of enslavement in 1865. California prevented African Americans from testifying in court against a white person, leading to what one legislator called a legislative license for the commission of crimes. The ban on African American testimony was repealed in 1863. The California legislature and Governor Henry Haight, quote, 1867 to 1871, end quote, opposed Congress's Reconstruction civil rights laws and delayed ratifying the 14th and 15th Amendments to the federal Constitution. California disenfranchised African American citizens through racial barriers to voting, such as poll taxes and literacy tests. California prohibited interracial marriage and passed an anti-miscegenation law in its first legislative session in 1850. The legislature repeatedly refused to repeal the law after the California Supreme Court struck it down in 1948 and only did so 11 years later. California constructed monuments, memorials, state markers, and plaques memorializing and preserving Confederate culture and glorifying slavery and white supremacy. From the brutality of enslavement to contemporary police killings, state and local governments sanctioned violence such as lynching, coercive sterilization, torture, and property destruction, inflicted death, physical injuries, and psychological harms on African Americans. In particular, the Ku Klux Klan exerted significant political influence in local governments across California. California endorsed minstrel shows. California openly allowed segregation and discrimination against African Americans in the United States with respect to musicians, workers, and artists. California crafted restrictive zoning ordinances, licensing laws, fire and safety codes, and anti-nuisance laws to disrupt African American businesses and their customers. The racially targeted enforcement, eminent domain, and outright exclusion, these restrictions disproportionately adversely affected African Americans, especially descendants. California also targeted African American musicians, including hip hop artists and African American owned businesses that provided leisure and opportunities in safe communal spaces to African Americans in California. California censored cinematic depictions of discrimination in African Americans integrating in white society. California implemented anti-cruising, anti-gathering laws and curfews that disproportionately and adversely affected African Americans, especially descendants. In 2021, California law recognized the celebrated history and culture of cruising by encouraging local officials and law enforcement to work with local car clubs to conduct safe cruising events, in effect, condemning anti-cruising, anti-gathering laws. California law enforcement and local governments harassed and suppressed the Black Panther Party in the 1960s and 70s. Discriminatory housing policies, including redlining, residential zoning ordinances, long practices have produced persistent and long-standing housing segregation and inequities in home ownership in California. By 2019, African American California's home ownership rate was less than the 1960s, when certain forms of housing discrimination were legal. The state of California and local governments targeted property owned by African Americans in urban renewal and development projects for unjust uses of eminent domain, and often without providing just compensation. As a result, the construction of public infrastructure in California disproportionately displaced and fractured African American communities. Added by voters in 1950 through the passage of Proposition 10, Article 34 of the California Constitution requires local voter approval before any state agency can build low-income housing projects. Proponents of Proposition 10 appealed to the racist fears of integrating neighborhoods to ensure its passage. State Senator Earl Desmond authored the argument in favor of Proposition 10 in the official ballot guide, and it was also supported by State Senator Arthur H. Bree Jr. Article 34 has been an impediment to efficiently building affordable housing and promoting residential racial integration. California enabled oil and gas production and hazardous waste facilities to be disproportionately located near African American majority neighborhoods, leading to the increased exposure of carcinogenic chemicals and greater health consequences like asthma, especially for African American children growing up in those neighborhoods. State and local segregation laws historically excluded African Americans from outdoor recreation, public transit, and other public infrastructure. Whites-only policies erected barriers to myriad facets of life, from where one can swim to where one could live. Prior to school segregation ending in 1890, California either denied education to African American children completely or forced them to attend segregated schools with fewer resources and funding than the schools attended by white children. Even after 1890, African American students continue to attend inadequately funded, under-resourced, and highly segregated public schools. Government policies segregated schools and school funding by neighborhoods through racially restricted covenants, opposition to integration plans, and the use of local property tax revenue for education funding. Unequal funding led to fewer opportunities for African American students, including less competitive courses for college admission and heightened referral to law enforcement for school code infractions. From November 1964 until 1967, when it was declared unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court, Proposition 14 amended the California Constitution to nullify the 1963 Rumford Fair Housing Act and earlier fair housing provisions and allow California property sellers, landlords, and agents to continue to segregate communities on racial grounds when selling or renting accommodations, undermining efforts to integrate schools through the desegregation of communities. State Senator Jack Skerrad authored the argument in favor of Proposition 14 for the official ballot guide, and the Los Angeles Times and Oakland Tribune explicitly supported passage of Proposition 14. The proposition was also supported by the California Republican Assembly, the largest California Republican organization, and the United Republicans of California, a smaller Republican organization. California voters and courts intentionally segregated students by race after the Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court decision ruling in 1954. In 1979, majority white Californians approved Proposition 1, a law that stopped courts from ordering school desegregation plans unless families or students suing to desegregate the schools could prove that intentional discrimination by school officials caused the desegregation, or a federal court can impose the same order. Proposition 1 was spearheaded by Allen Roberts, state senator from the 20th district, quote, San Fernando Valley, end quote, and was in fact also referred to as the Robbins Amendment. From the mid to the late 70s through the 1990s, courts removed or limited desegregation orders in many California districts. California then Governor Ronald Reagan, quote, 1967 to 1975, end quote, was recorded making racist remarks to then President Nixon regarding African delegates to the United Nations. In 1996, California voters approved Proposition 209, which terminated state and local government affirmative action programs in public employment, public education, and public contracting to the extent these programs involve preferential treatment based on race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin. Proposition 209 was supported by Governor Pete Wilson, quote, 1991 to 1999, end quote, who authored the arguments in favor of Proposition 209 in the official voter guide, and Attorney General Daniel Lundgren. Ward Connolly, a member of the University of California Board of Regents, was chairperson of the campaign, along with Darrell Israel. This resulted in an annual loss of more than $1 billion of minority and women-owned businesses, perpetuating the wealth gap between races. Proposition 209 also significantly reduced the enrollment level of African American students at California Public University. Still further, Proposition 209 substantially limits the state from remedying the systemic racism in California in education, housing, wealth, employment, and healthcare, which is implanted in laws, policies, and institutions that perpetuate racial inequalities. Demonstrating how challenges to equity for African Americans continue today, Proposition 209 was reaffirmed in 2020 when California voters failed to pass Proposition 16, which would have permitted the reintroduction of these critical programs in California. Sorry about that. California's child welfare system have experienced some of the worst racial disparities in the country, with African American children suffering the highest rate of system involvement and correspondingly heightened risks and harms associated with entering foster care. Among other inequities, youth who enter foster care exhibit achievement gaps compared to children not involved in foster care. The eugenics movement thrived in California, and thousands of African Americans were forcibly sterilized or were the subject of medical experiments without consent. State psychological institutions contributed to the over-incarceration, forced sterilization, and denial of educational opportunities for African Americans in California. California law enforcement disproportionately stops, arrests, injures, and kills people perceived to be Black or African American. Partially as a direct result of the above, African Americans are overrepresented in the state correctional facilities, and African American youth are overrepresented in juvenile facilities. Consequently, the collateral effects of arrest and conviction also disproportionately impact African Americans in California. The California Constitution continues to permit involuntary servitude as a form of criminal punishment and an exception that disproportionately harms African Americans, given the over-policing and over-incarceration of African American Californians and other biases in the criminal legal system. California historically barred African Americans from serving on juries. Today, California prosecutors' discriminatory use of preemptory challenges continues to disproportionately exclude African Americans from juries. African American California experienced persistent discrimination in healthcare services and access to inadequate diagnosis, use of involuntary force, high costs, and lack of culturally competent services. As a result, African Americans suffered desperate health outcomes. African American mothers experienced significantly higher rates of maternal mortality and infant death than any other ethnic group. The life expectancy of an average African American Californian is 75.1 years, 6 years shorter than the state average. Compared with white Californians, Black Californians are more likely to have diabetes, die from cancer, or be hospitalized for heart disease. State license systems historically worked in tandem with unions and professional societies to exclude African American workers from skilled, higher-paying jobs. State and local governments failed to meaningfully protect the equal rights of African American workers and job applicants, denying African Americans secure jobs, higher pay, and career advancement, particularly in the public sector employment. African Americans have been routinely excluded from professional careers in California. For example, African American physicians, psychiatrists, and psychiatrists are underrepresented in California's medical field, furthering the inequalities in the healthcare system. And African Americans comprise 6% of the adult population in California, but only 3% of all attorneys, while in contrast, white people comprise 39% of California's adult population, but 66% of all states' licensed attorneys. In addition to acknowledging these and other atrocities committed by the state, as delineated in this report, the legislature's formally apology should also acknowledge California's responsibility to repair the harms and guarantee non-repetition. To be effective, A considerable number of survivors and their relatives must participate in the development of the apology. As occurred with the apology to California tribal communities, the legislature should establish a program or government body such as the California American Freedmen Affairs Agency to facilitate listening sessions that allow victims and their relatives to narrate personal experiences and recount specific injustices caused by the state of California. The listening sessions should inform the language of the legislature's apologies and the methods enacted by the legislature to satisfy victims. In rendering its apology, the legislature should also find a way to effect specific recognition of all who come forward to participate in these listening sessions and share their personal stories of harm, loss, and deprivations of liberty. Additionally, the legislature should order the commission of plaques or other public commemorative tributes to secure community's memory of the victims and the injustices as occurred in the California apology for forced sterilization. Physical markers of past atrocities serve as reminders of the terror and harm and ensure the collective memory does not gloss over the past. Curated in cooperation with victims of the atrocity delineated in this report and their families and atrocities and advocates, plaques and memorials should honor survivors and raise awareness of descendants on ongoing struggle for justice. For all aspects of the state's apology, the task force recommend that there be intensive public education and communication strategy. The legislature should ensure the pursuit of the task force recommendations for educating the public set forth in Chapter 33 includes this requirement and funding for its development and implementation. And that will conclude tonight's reading of Chapter 16 of the California Reparations Task Force final report. Before you go, if you haven't done so already, don't forget to please like this video, hit the bell for reminders, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. When you go, don't forget to get connected. Follow CJEC on all our social media platforms, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and X, formerly known as Twitter as CJEC Official. Get informed, visit www.cjecofficial.org and sign up for current and accurate California reparations news and info on our Get Involved page. Get involved. Support our work by volunteering and or donating. To donate, just click the Donate tab on the home page of our website. And special thanks to our amazing fiscal sponsor, the California Black Women's Health Project. Thank you all so much for your time. I appreciate you all. I personally would like to thank Chris Larson, CJEC members at large, CJEC organizing, mobilizing volunteer readers, Amend the Mass Media Group, and last but not least, the American Redress Coalition of California Bay Area, ARC Bay Area, for their advocacy for reparations in California. Remember, we're closer to reparations than we've ever been before in California. Have a great night, and we'll see you next Thursday. Thank you.